Bonjour. Un peu français, so I speak in English. Thank you very much to the organisers for the opportunity to speak this afternoon. I want to talk very briefly about the current trends in extreme weather we're seeing in Australia. Refer in a fair bit of detail to some major fires we had in 2009 that we call Black Saturday, and then go on to the very significant changes in fire management policy which have occurred not only in the state of Victoria where those fires occurred, but also through the rest of the country. The first point to make is that the southeast of Australia and the southwest of Australia is one of the most fire-prone areas in the world. This is something we share with the south of France and many parts of the North American continent. The ecosystems, the natural ecosystem in Australia is well adapted to fire and in fact requires fire for the maintenance of many of the native species, particularly the eucalypt and the wattle species. One of the paradoxes about fire in Australia is that success in putting out small fires means that the natural occurrence of fire in the landscape is suppressed, which then means that you have more fuels available for major fires when the weather conditions turn bad. In the fire season that we've just seen, 2012-13, in Australia we saw 123 weather records being broken. This is unprecedented in Australia. Many of the aspects of climate change which speakers this morning have highlighted are also occurring in Australia. But we are seeing, from a firefighting point of view, climate change occurring in front of our eyes. We're seeing hotter, drier summers with more severe fire behaviour. This graph is from an organisation called the Climate Commission, which was formed by the former Australian government. And in describing climate change to practitioners like myself, they have using the bell curve, and the line on the left-hand side is the climate as we see it now, and what they're proposing is that with climate change the bell curve will shift to the right, which means that there will be more hot days, and the hot days will become hotter and the cooler days will become warmer. So we're seeing fewer cold days, more hot days and hotter hot days. The Climate Commission talks about this decade as being a critical decade, reinforcing that the climate system is shifting, that there are an increased likelihood of extreme weather events which will have a greater impact on people, properties, communities and the environment, and they're saying from the point of view of mitigating climate change, the time for action is now. It's interesting that the government in Australia changed about 3 weeks ago. We now have a change of government, and one of the first things that the new government did was to scrap the Climate Commission because it was seen that the messages were too negative and serving as a disincentive for foreign investment. So the Climate Commission no longer exists. If we look at the context in the last 10 years, this is the state of Victoria, which is down in the southwest of Australia, southeast of Australia, and this indicates since 2002 a number of very large fires, mega fires could be used as a term, which have burnt in Victoria in the last 10 years. In fact, in Australia, we've seen major fires in 2002 in New South Wales and around the Australian Capital Territory, in 2003 in Victoria, in 2005 in South Australia, and in Victoria in 2007, 2009 and 2013, the fire season that we've just seen. Of significance, in 2013, we saw a major fire reburn an area that had been burnt by a significant fire only 6 years earlier. One of the speakers this morning, Johan, talked about an increase in the repetition time for fire. And one of the consequences of this area that reburned is that it burned so quickly that the trees haven't had an opportunity to set mature fruit. So that's requiring the forest managers to go in there and reseed the area. This is not a very clear graph, but the left-hand column is a sum of the daily fire dangers on an annual basis. And the clear message here with the trend upwards is that the average number of days and the sum of the days of some of the fire danger on days over the summer period is increasing. So there's a clear message there that since the 1930s we're seeing increased days of fire danger throughout Australia and in Victoria. If we move now to examine the 2009 Black Saturday bushfires, these are very significant bushfires in Australia. 173 people lost their lives, and there was a very substantial inquiry after the event. Prior to the event, though, much of southeastern Australia and Victoria in particular had suffered long-term drought. This map indicates 3 years of drying, 1998 through to 2010, but in fact the 2 or 3 years immediately prior to the Black Saturday bushfires were characterised by some of the most severe drought that Victoria has ever seen. So in essence, in the lead up to the 2009 fires, we'd seen about 11 or 12 years of continual drought in southeastern Australia. Also, in the lead up to the day of Black Saturday on the 7th of February, we saw a sustained heat wave through southeastern Australia. So you see the temperatures on the left-hand axis there. What that indicates is that we had a significant number of days in a row where the maximum temperature was above 30 degrees, and very significantly the overnight minimum temperature only dropped by a few degrees. I think it was also Johan who talked about the loss of life according to heat wave, and whilst 173 people died in the bushfires on Black Saturday, there were over 350 people who died from the effects of heat in the same period, but without the same level of inquiry. But there is no doubt that the heat wave was an important precursor to Black Saturday. On Black Saturday, there were 15 significant fires. All of those fires burned more than 1,000 hectares, and as a consequence of those fires, 173 people lost their lives. There were thousands of dwellings were burnt out. There was major interruption to infrastructure. These were fires that could not be extinguished on the day. I'll just run through a number of photographs that indicate the extent of the fire behaviour. One of the characteristics of fire behaviour on these days was exceptionally strong winds in the order of 90 to 110 kilometres an hour. They come from northern Australia, they're very dry, and then characterised by a change in the wind direction late in the evening, which means a flank fire on the east side of the fire then becomes a head fire. And this is indeed what occurred on that day. The photographs you see on the overhead are not dissimilar to scenes that were seen across Victoria. These were not fires that could be extinguished during the height of the fire danger. Indeed, the Royal Commission that inquired into these fires identified that these fires were impossible to suppress, and they talked about these fires being ferocious, which is a new terminology that has been developed in Australia for these mega fires, ferocious fires that we cannot stop. There was a government-instituted Royal Commission, which is the highest court of inquiry that one can have in Australia, that was established to inquire into the lead up to and the consequences and how these fires were managed. And one of the most significant findings of the Royal Commission was a lack of provision of warnings by the fire authorities. So here we see a situation where the traditional focus of the fire agencies has been to do their best to go out, find the fire and suppress the fire. And it's interesting that the topic of this meeting and this conference is around forest fire. And again, if I could refer to Johann's presentation, where he talks about urban fire being well organised, and he talks about forest fire being well organised. And indeed, what we saw on Black Saturday was fires that went well beyond the public land forest estate into private land, into the interface, and in some cases burning out whole towns during that event. And under these conditions, the Royal Commission questioned the strategies and the tactics of the fire agencies, who continued to try to put out the fires under conditions when we knew that we couldn't put out those fires. And the Royal Commission concluded, and this was a very harsh conclusion, that we would have been better not to respond to the fire, but to issue warnings to people who were in the path of the fire. And if we'd been able to produce warnings that were more timely and more relevant, in fact, there may have been more lives saved from that fire. The Royal Commission ran for over 12 months. It produced 67 recommendations in areas of policy, emergency and incident management, fireground response strategy, power line safety. Many of these fires were started by arcing safety policy. Prior to the Black Saturday bushfires, the Australian fire agencies had what we call a prepare to stay and defend or leave early policy. This is something that had developed after a previous set of significant fires in 1983. And in 1983 we discovered that if people were able-bodied and they had stayed with their home, in fact they could defend their home quite successfully. The policy, however, was found by the Royal Commission to have some flaws. They didn't trash the policy, they didn't say it was completely irrelevant, but they said that the policy did not recognise the risk of defending your house from bushfire, and that under these conditions of extreme weather conditions and ferocious fire behaviour, there were too many people who attempted to protect their own property who had no real understanding as to how difficult it was, and they had no concept as to how successful they may or may not be. And as a result, many people who attempted to save their property made a last-minute decision that they weren't going to be successful. They got in their vehicle and they tried to leave. And the photograph there indicates the fate of too many people on that day who left too late because they couldn't defend their property. We have been learning lots about how people died and how houses were lost. What we now know, and this is not just from the Black Saturday bushfires, but also from fires in Canberra and South Australia and New South Wales, that 80% of house loss occurs within 150 metres of the hazard. And the major hazard in Australia is unburnt forest. So what we know is that in the history of fire in Australia, 80% of houses which are lost are within 150 metres of the hazard. 70% of the people who lose their lives lost their lives within 100 metres of the hazard. And the majority of the people beyond that 70% lost their lives whilst they were attempting to flee at the last minute. A significant change in policy, therefore, has been to recognise that the primacy of life is paramount. So as fire agencies, our focus has shifted from a sole principal focus on putting out the fire to one where our primary consideration is the primacy of life. And the primacy of life includes the protection of firefighters. The new bushfire policy includes consideration of shelter options. It highlights the need for a shared responsibility between citizens who live or travel or work in the hazard and the fire agencies. But it also highlights difficulty in interpreting and implementing these shared responsibilities. What we know from our research that we do every year is that most people don't really understand the risk of the area that they live in, and they don't understand exactly what their responsibilities are. So we see the challenge of communicating and changing the behaviour of our community as a long-term strategy that we're aiming for. From a fire agency point of view, and most states in Australia have urban fire services, have rural fire services, and have forest fire services. We now have a single set of what we call state control priorities. And indeed, these aren't just priorities for bushfire or for forest fire. These are priorities that we also exercise for flood, for earthquake, for a wide range of emergencies. The first priority goes to the preservation and protection of life, which is paramount, and that includes the safety of emergency services personnel, community members, and tourists. A priority is to issue community information and warnings, to protect community infrastructure and assets, protect residential property, protect individual assets which support business and commerce, and protect the environment and conservation. One of the things that we saw over Black Saturday, and we've been seeing for 3 or 4 years now, is exceptional fire behaviour and exceptional fire danger. This has caused us to look at our forest fire danger ratings, and the 5 fire danger ratings there pre-existed the 2009 fires, but after the extreme conditions in 2009, the control agencies had a national meeting and we identified the need to designate a new category of bushfire risk, which we call Code Red or catastrophic. And this is now a revised set of fire danger ratings that we have adopted in Australia. Since 2009 in Victoria, there have only been 2 occasions when we've seen Code Red fire behaviour. But we feel that the necessity of organising an additional fire danger rating will allow us to identify and communicate the exceptional conditions for those very severe days. Our new policy is around preparing, acting and surviving. It's to highlight the partnership and the shared responsibility. It's about advising our citizens that the best option on the left is to leave early, to be well prepared, but if you are unfortunate enough to be at your dwelling or in a location where a fire occurs, then you may need to seek a refuge of last resort. So we have a range of options and advices that we give to the public. There has been a great expectation on many members of the public that the state provide shelter options. And in the 12 months after the Black Saturday bushfires, there was a new policy identified where we identified what we call Bushfire Neighborhoods safer places, which were identified as a place of last resort. So in some cases this might be a sporting oval, this might be a car park, or it might be a shopping centre, and we designate these as a neighbourhood safer place. We have a fire behaviour expert who assesses the radiant heat flux which could be withstood at that level, and each of these is certified and is updated and monitored on an annual basis. Across the state of Victoria, we only have 265 of these locations, but it's one effort to address the expectation in the community that the government provide something for the community. What we are also doing is experimenting with the development of community refuges. These are large buildings which potentially could give shelter to between 200 and 300 people, use of concrete, underground, and often built in conjunction with a new fire station or a public building. We have 3 of these which are under construction as a trial. My fear is that as these come online, the expectation of the community will increase. A further type of shelter has occurred, and that is a shelter which is built on an individual home or an individual dwelling basis, and there are many people who are investing of their own accord. They live in a fire-prone area, they do accept the risk, but they're choosing to build a shelter. We also revised our system of providing warnings to the community. Given that provision of warnings is now a priority, we have 3 types of warning. The first level is an advice warning that's simply saying that something is happening and you need to be listening to the radio or watching the television. The second is what we call a watch and act, and that is when a fire is occurring and you need to do something, you need to act. And the third is what we call an emergency warning, which means that there is an imminent threat. And again, we use posters such as this to try and identify the types of warnings. The bottom of this poster, though, identifies the full range of media that we use. So we put warnings out over the internet, the radio, television. We have a number of emergency websites. We use social media, and we monitor both Facebook and Twitter. And in a lot of cases, we communicate with citizens in the field using that social media. This is an example of the advertising campaign that we used during the last fire season, and the intent here was to encourage people to leave early when the fire danger risk occurs or when a fire starts up in the local area. So our plea to people is to stay connected, monitor the fire danger, and our responsibility is that when a fire occurs, we'll talk to people about the fire risk as it increases. A number of the speakers this morning also talked about the need for increased planning at a local level. And since the 2009 fires, there has been a re-examination of our local planning, and in each of over 300 communities, we produce a little brochure like this, but we don't do the planning ourselves. We plan with the local emergency services and local citizens and property owners. So they actually become part of the plan, and in a number of locations, they take the planning process from us and do it themselves, which is the way we want it. There was a question this morning about the ICS system, which occurs in North America and Canada. In Australia, we have a system which is based on the ICS system. We call it AIMS, the Australasian Inter-Service Incident Management System. The structure is very similar to ICS, except that we've recently reviewed it, and we identify a number of functions, including intelligence, public information, and finance, which are in addition to the key functions, which I think might be sub-functions of ICS. We also have a very rigorous process for identifying, training and developing our incident controllers. That means that we identify them when they're at the medium incident controller level. We mentor and develop them. We have a system where they undergo 4 series of psychological assessments. They do scenario testing. They get put into real-life situations with a mentor, and it's only when we're 100% satisfied that they can take the pressure of being an incident controller that we sign off on them. We are also moving to a system where we pre-form our level 3 or our major incident management teams, and we're also moving to have automatic dispatch of firefighting aircraft. A major recommendation from the Royal Commission was to increase the proportion of public land which is subject to planned burning, prescribed burning. And the government has asked that we burn 5% of public land every year, which is over 380,000 hectares. We are also using computer modelling to do real-time modelling of fires as they occur. And we also use this modelling to identify in our townships where the high-risk areas are. So a lot of our fire prevention, our targeted community messaging, we don't just do that broadcast. We've realised that doesn't work. We'll go to individual properties that we've identified as being high risk. I'll close on a comment that Johan talked about this morning, about this being broader than just the fire agencies. And what we have found in Australia is that when we have a major forest fire or a major bushfire, we don't just talk to the fire agencies. We talk to people who might be involved in transport. We talk to people within government. We talk to people in the Department of Health and Human Services. We talk to policymakers, and as well as local government. So we have a system where there is a much greater focus on identifying the consequences to the emergency as well as managing the emergency itself. So we hope by having this broader focus that whilst an emergency is occurring, there can be a greater forecasting of the impact on the community and infrastructure, and what individual citizens may want. It's not uncommon for us to have a major fire that starts at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and by 6 o'clock that night we'll be holding a public meeting seeking input and having dialogue with citizens about how they expect the fire to be fought. And obviously the impact on water catchments is also another major effect for us. I think I'll just close by saying there are a number of traditional things that we do. So with a whole lot of high-tech equipment, we still rely on people working together, and certainly the mantra in Australia is very much about people working together, working as one, so that we can face the challenges of the future. Thank you very much.